September 16th, 2019, just outside Conyers, Georgia. The hour was 4 a.m. The neighborhood was still, save for the distant hum of highway trucks. Most of Rockdale County was fast asleep. Inside this home, a family of 3 residents were winding down another ordinary night. A husband and wife, a close friend staying over. They were unaware that in the shadows of their own front yard, 3 masked figures had appeared. 2 of them were brothers, 16-year-old Isaiah Reid and his twin Jaime Hernandez. With them, a 15-year-old companion. Teenagers, still in high school, yet this night they had crossed a line few ever come back from. What brought them here in the darkest hours of morning is a question their families would ask for the rest of their lives. But what happened next would ripple across the community, the courts, and the country. One of the masked teens raised his weapon, fired. Muzzle flash lit the yard. The family screamed. The homeowner drew his own firearm and returned fire. I heard a guy yelling, "Help me, I'm dying." Brian Jenkins, a nearby resident, sprinted out to the edge of his lawn. There, lying in the grass, a boy gasped for breath, blood soaking his shirt. Jenkins knelt, helpless, clutching the teen's hand. An ambulance is on the way. You're not going to die. But the boy did. In that moment, his life ended. 2 other teens were sprawled on the driveway, groaning in agony. Within minutes, deputies with the Rockdale County Sheriff's Office swarmed the street. By dawn, all 3 suspects would be pronounced dead. Not a single resident inside the home was injured. On the ground, deputies recovered at least 2 weapons. Who fired first? Witnesses said the teenagers had opened fire. The homeowner's return shots were fatal. This could possibly be a stand-your-ground case. In Georgia, a homeowner does not have to retreat when confronted with deadly force. The law allows one to stand their ground. But legal language offers little comfort to a neighborhood rocked by gunfire. Was this a clear case of self-defense, or the tragic death of 3 young boys who made one terrible decision? In the aftermath, families would clash with law enforcement. Neighbors would argue over blame, and a debate as old as America itself, gun rights, youth crime, and justice, would roar to life once again. Conyers, Georgia, a town of contrast just 25 miles east of Atlanta, yet far from the chaos of the city. A place where life moves at its own rhythm. A place where neighbors wave as they pass. Where kids ride bikes down sidewalks in the summer heat. Where people say they feel safe. But on the morning of September 16th, 2019, that sense of safety shattered. The man inside the house, the man who pulled the trigger, was not an outsider. He wasn't a stranger drifting through town. He was one of them. A husband, a truck driver who worked long shifts, sometimes overnight, sometimes out of state to provide for his family. He had lived here for years. He knew the street. He knew his neighbors. He knew which porch light stayed on all night and which houses went dark before 10. His neighbors described him as quiet, steady, not one to draw attention. He was the kind of man who minded his business. Not unfriendly, not standoffish, just regular. He worked, he came home, he took care of his wife. Nobody thought he'd ever be in the middle of something like this. He didn't patrol the neighborhood. He didn't play the role of a watchman. But he was protective. This was his home, his family. And when strangers showed up in the dead of night, masked and armed, instinct took over. The other side of the story belongs to 3 teenage boys. 16-year-old Isaiah Reid, his twin brother, Jaime Hernandez, and their 15-year-old friend. Kids. Barely old enough to drive, barely old enough to think beyond tomorrow. The Reid brothers weren't strangers to the community either. They had gone to school here, played basketball in the same driveways, walked the same sidewalks. To many, they were just kids from the neighborhood. But that morning, their faces were covered, and they were carrying guns, according to the statement made from Sheriff Eric Levitt. One of the young men brandished a gun and fired shots at the residents. The homeowner returned fire, striking all three suspects. What brought them here at 4 in the morning? Was it money, a dare, a test of courage? Their families would later insist the boys weren't criminals. They had dreams, ambitions, quirks like every other teenager, but they also had struggles, pressures. And that night, those pressures boiled over into a single, irreversible decision. By daylight, the neighborhood was in shock. The sound of gunfire had carried across lawns, through thin walls, jolting families awake. And now the street was littered with shell casings, flashing blue and red lights, and questions no one wanted to ask out loud. Some neighbors said the homeowner had done what anyone would do: defend their family. Others whispered in grief. 3 young lives were gone. Too quickly, too violently. They didn't deserve to die like that. They were young. They had time to change. They weren't monsters. For the families of the teenagers, grief mixed with outrage. How could their sons be remembered only as criminals when they were still just boys? For the homeowner and his family, relief mixed with trauma. They were alive, but they had taken lives. Georgia law is clear. You don't have to run. If you believe you're facing deadly force, you're allowed to meet it with deadly force. Sheriff Eric Levitt himself called it what it appeared to be: a possible stand-your-ground case. But clarity in the law doesn't erase the unease. 3 teenagers are dead. A man has killed them in his own front yard. The neighbors who thought they knew everyone suddenly aren't sure what to believe. Were these boys hardened criminals or reckless kids making one terrible mistake? Did the homeowner save his family from a deadly attack? Or did he overreact to children too young to truly know what they were doing? These questions would haunt Conyers for months. And as the investigation began, the answers would prove far more complicated than anyone expected. By 6 a.m., White Oak Court was transformed. What only hours earlier had been a quiet cul-de-sac was now saturated with flashing lights, crime scene vans, and deputies pacing back and forth. Neighbors who had been jolted awake by gunfire stood in clusters, whispering, trying to piece together what they had just lived through. 3 teenagers lay dead, 2 at the hospital, 1 in the grass. A homeowner and his family were alive, and for Sheriff Eric Levitt, the question was immediate. Was this tragedy a crime or an act of self-defense? 2 handguns were recovered. Investigators confirmed at least one of the teens had discharged his weapon. The exchange wasn't imagined. It was real, fast, and deadly. Sheriff Levitt would later explain, one of the young men brandished a gun and fired shots at the residents. The homeowner returned fire, striking all 3 suspects. The sheriff's words left no ambiguity. This wasn't just kids fooling around in masks. It was an armed confrontation. Gunfire on both sides. Sheriff Levitt, a veteran lawman with decades in Rockdale County, chose his phrasing carefully. This could possibly be a stand-your-ground case, he told reporters. The final decision will rest with the district attorney's office. The phrase carried weight. In Georgia, stand your ground isn't just a legal statute. It's a cultural fault line. And now it was at the center of this tragedy. 3 young lives cut short, 1 family forever changed, and a neighborhood left to debate whether the night of September 16th was justice or tragedy. Isaiah Reid, 16 years old, described by relatives as bright, quick-witted, protective of his younger siblings. His twin brother, Jaime Hernandez, shared the same smile, the same energy, and often the same trouble. Their 15-year-old friend, unnamed publicly at the time because of his age, was younger, quieter, known more as a follower than a leader. Interviews from one of the people around said, "They were normal kids. They had friends. They had dreams. Yeah, they got into things they shouldn't have, but they weren't monsters." But in the months leading up to that night, cracks had begun to show. Social media posts hinted at risky behavior. Deputies later revealed the teens had access to firearms. Guns likely passed hand to hand in circles that stretched far beyond Conyers High School. For some, it was the familiar story of young men pulled toward the streets, temptation outweighing caution. Why at 4 a.m.? Why a quiet cul-de-sac where families were asleep? Investigators pieced together a theory. The teens were attempting a robbery. A quick, bold move relying on masks to intimidate and guns to control. But even that theory opened more questions. Were they desperate for money? Showing off to each other? Testing boundaries in a way that spiraled out of control? Criminologist interview in this case said, "Adolescents are impulsive. Their brains aren't wired yet for long-term thinking. At 15, 16, you don't think about tomorrow. You think about the moment. You think you're invincible. That's why crimes like this, high risk, no escape plan, happen over and over." The homeowner's name was never released, a measure taken for his protection. But neighbors described him as a family man, a truck driver, hardworking, often away for long stretches, home to rest with his loved ones. He wasn't known for disputes. He wasn't known for anger. To those who lived nearby, he was unremarkable in the best sense of the word. Ordinary. And that's what made the night so shocking. An ordinary man thrust into an extraordinary split-second decision. He told investigators the teens aimed their guns. Shots rang out. His choice was not whether to fight, but whether he and his family would survive. Conyers, like so many American towns, became divided. Some saw the incident as proof that gun rights mattered, that without his firearm, the homeowner would have been just another victim. If somebody points a gun at your kids, you don't wait to ask their age. You defend yourself. Others, though, saw 3 caskets and called it something else. A failure. You don't answer kids' mistakes with a firing squad. There had to be another way. The split wasn't just emotional. It was political. Georgia is one of more than 24 states with stand-your-ground laws. It allows citizens to meet force, without retreat. Supporters argue it empowers law-abiding homeowners to protect themselves. Opponents argue it creates shoot-first scenarios that escalate instead of defuse. Now, those abstract debates were no longer hypothetical. They were written in blood on White Oak Court, according to a legal scholar. What you see in Conyers is the collision of 2 truths. The teens were armed. The homeowner was justified in defending himself. And yet, 3 lives are gone. The law doesn't account for the tragedy. It only accounts for the legality. For the families of Isaiah, Jaime, and their young friend, the debate over law felt cold. We know what they did was wrong. But don't call them criminals. Don't just call them suspects. They were sons. They were brothers. They were ours. Their pain clashed with public opinion. To some, it sounded like denial. To others, it was simply grief, raw and human. National media descended on Conyers. To some outlets, it was a story about gun rights. To others, a story about youth violence. To still others, a racial narrative. 3 Latino teens, a homeowner whose identity remained concealed. The details blurred into commentary. The facts became symbols. And the truth of 3 young men's lives risked being drowned out by political debate. The case wasn't legally complicated. Evidence showed the teens were armed and shots were fired. The district attorney would eventually confirm the homeowner acted in lawful self-defense. But the moral dilemma couldn't be boxed away so easily. Should kids with poor judgment be condemned to die in a crossfire? Should a homeowner hesitate when his family is threatened at gunpoint? And how does a community heal when both sides are right and both sides are wrong? The case was unfolding. The facts were clear, but the meaning of those facts was anything but. For days after the shooting, the Rockdale County Sheriff's Office combed through the evidence. They studied ballistics. They tested fingerprints on the recovered handguns. They matched trajectories of bullets lodged in siding, in the grass, and in parked cars nearby. The evidence was undeniable. At least one of the teenagers had fired at the homeowner and his family first. The exchange of gunfire wasn't a matter of dispute. It was science. That was the breakthrough investigators needed. It framed the narrative not as a mystery, but as a matter of law. When the file landed on the desk of District Attorney Alicia Johnson, she faced a decision. Was this case a prosecution or a closure? In many homicide cases, prosecutors weigh motives, intent, and opportunity. Here, the question was far narrower. Did the homeowner have the right to defend himself? Under Georgia law, a person who is threatened with deadly force has no duty to retreat. They are entitled to stand their ground. It was the crux of the case, and with the evidence confirming the teens fired first, Johnson concluded what Sheriff Levitt had suggested from the start. This was self-defense. There would be no jury, no weeks-long testimony, no dramatic cross-examinations. But in the court of public opinion, the trial was already underway. On one side, gun rights advocates pointing to the case as proof that self-defense laws worked. That man protected his family. If he hadn't been armed, we'd be talking about a funeral for him today. On the other side, grieving families, faith leaders, and youth advocates who saw 3 young lives erased in a single night. They made a mistake. But mistakes shouldn't mean death sentences. Even without a trial, the questions were argued as if before a jury. Did the homeowner use reasonable force? Could he have fired a warning shot? Should he have recognized the boy's age before pulling the trigger? According to a legal scholar, the law doesn't ask if the homeowner could have done something different. It asks if his fear of imminent death or great bodily harm was reasonable. Once those guns were raised, age didn't matter. Masks didn't matter. Only the threat mattered. In Georgia, that legal framing was decisive. But for the community, the moral debate raged on. The families of the teens demanded answers. They asked why their sons were portrayed as hardened criminals when they were still in school. They questioned the homeowner's choices, the sheriff's narrative, the media's framing. Our kids made mistakes, but they didn't deserve to die. There has to be another way to handle things like this. But legally, the system had already closed its book. The shooting was ruled justified. There would be no charges, no courtroom reckoning. As the case hit national media, it became something larger than a local tragedy. To some outlets, it was about gun rights. The armed homeowner who survived because he refused to retreat. To others, it was about youth crime, the epidemic of teenagers gaining access to weapons, and the fatal choices that followed. And to still others, it was a racial and social story. 3 Latino boys from working-class families whose lives ended not in classrooms or ball fields, but in the crossfire of a homeowner's gun. To an activist who voiced out, "We can't just bury these kids and call it justice. We need to ask why they had guns, why they thought this was the path, and what we're doing to stop the next tragedy." In another timeline, this case could have played out in court. Prosecutors could have put the homeowner on trial, tested the boundaries of Georgia's stand your ground laws, allowed a jury to weigh age against intent. But in reality, the trial existed only in headlines, in vigils, in social media debates, and in the memories of neighbors who still heard gunfire in their dreams. The legal system delivered its answer. But the deeper truths about kids, about guns, about choices made in a single instant remained unresolved. The gunshots had faded, the evidence was logged, the case was closed. But for those who lived through that night, the silence that followed was anything but peaceful. Brian Jenkins still remembers the cries, "Help me, I'm dying." Those words haunted him more than the gunfire. The echoes returned in the quiet hours of the night, replaying like a broken record. Some neighbors began locking their doors earlier, installing new floodlights, buying firearms of their own. Others couldn't shake the unease. This was supposed to be a quiet suburban corner of Georgia, not a place where 3 teens would die in a shootout at 4 a.m. For the homeowner, whose name was withheld by authorities, the law had cleared him. But inside his home, the victory felt hollow. Neighbors said he became more withdrawn, avoiding public spaces, carrying the weight of knowing he had ended 3 young lives, even if in self-defense. He was no longer just a man living in Conyers. He was the man who had killed 3 masked teenagers. Self-defense had spared him a trial, but it had not spared him the trial of memory. For the families of the teens, grief hardened into something more, a call for change. They spoke at vigils. They gathered at churches. They marched in silence down the streets of Conyers, holding signs that read, "Justice for our boys," and "Youth need guidance, not graves." They weren't perfect, but they were our sons. They laughed, they played, they had dreams. That night took everything away. Their message was not to excuse the crime. It was to question a society where teenagers carried pistols, wore masks, and chose violence before dawn. The shooting reignited one of America's fiercest debates: stand your ground. Supporters said the case proved the law's necessity, that when faced with armed intruders, a homeowner should never hesitate to defend his family. Critics argued it blurred the line between defense and execution, that it encouraged escalation, not restraint. To legal experts, the law isn't just about protecting the innocent, it shapes behavior. When people know they can legally kill, it changes how quickly they pull the trigger. Georgia lawmakers didn't rewrite this statute, but the case became a talking point in legislative sessions and campaign speeches, another flashpoint in the country's ongoing struggle to balance safety with accountability. The 3 teens were remembered not just as suspects, but as sons, cousins, classmates. Isaiah Reid was 15. Jaime Hernandez and his brother, also teenagers, were 16. Too young to legally drink, too young to vote, yet old enough to carry guns and make one catastrophic choice. Why had they done it? Police reports pointed to robbery. Their families pointed to peer pressure, bad influences, and a system that failed to intervene in time. For many in Conyers, the real tragedy was not just that they died, but that they were ever on that lawn at all. The community itself fractured. Some praised the homeowner as a protector. Others condemned the outcome as preventable, even avoidable. A retired teacher asked, where were the programs for these kids? Where were the mentors? A gun rights advocate countered, where was the responsibility of the kids themselves? Guns don't walk onto lawns at 4 a.m. by themselves. The arguments never reached consensus, but they exposed the fault lines of a town and a country where violence is both feared and defended. Time moved on. Cases closed. News cycles shifted. But in Conyers, the night of September 16th, 2019, never really ended. The homeowners still lived behind drawn curtains. The families still visited graves instead of graduations. The neighbors still heard echoes of sirens when the night fell too quiet. In the end, the truth unraveled not in court filings or news articles, but in the lives left behind. The law had spoken, the guns had fallen silent. But the questions about justice, about choice, about the price of fear still lingered. Because in Conyers and across America, one story ended, only for 1,000 more to begin. Conyers is quiet again. The lawns are trimmed, the streetlights hum, but no one here sees this place the same way anymore. For the families of Isaiah Reid and the Hernandez brothers, the story has no ending. Their children were laid to rest in caskets too small, funerals too soon, dreams forever unfinished. They were not saints, but they were ours, and we will never understand why they thought guns and masks were their answer. Their grief is not just for the lives lost, but for the future that will never come. Birthdays missed, schools never graduated, voices that will never grow into adulthood. The homeowner has not spoken publicly. His name remains withheld. But neighbors say he carries the weight of that night like a shadow that will not leave. He was not charged. The sheriff called it self-defense. Yet, in the quiet of his home, there is no legal ruling strong enough to silence memory. He lives with the knowledge that 3 young men are gone because of a decision he made in seconds. What happened in Conyers is not just a local tragedy, it is a chapter in a larger American story, one written in headlines, police reports, and grieving families from Florida to Missouri, from Georgia to California. Stand your ground laws remain on the books in over half the country. Supporters say they protect the innocent. Critics say they embolden the trigger. But whichever side one stands on, the truth is harder to ignore. The number of children and teenagers killed by gunfire in America has risen, not fallen. The Conyers case became another example, another flashpoint, another debate. But for those who lived it, it is not numbers. It is memory. Could it have been prevented? If there were more programs for struggling teens, would Isaiah Reid and the Hernandez brothers have been on that lawn at 4 a.m.? If there were fewer guns in circulation, would a mask and a pistol still seem like power in the hands of a boy not yet grown? If fear did not run so deep, would a homeowner have pulled the trigger or paused just 1 second longer? These questions hang unanswered. They may never be answered, but they demand to be asked. For some, the echoes remain. The homeowner trapped in silence, the families trapped in grief, the community trapped between fear and regret, and a nation still divided on where justice ends and tragedy begins. In the end, the law called it self-defense. The families called it injustice. The neighbors called it unforgettable. And America still calls it a debate. But behind the headlines, 3 boys are gone. 1 man will never sleep the same again. And a community will forever carry the weight of a night when fear met tragedy. And both won. In the end, justice is not the last word. Memory is.